The air in the garage was thick with the scent of oil and dust, a stale reminder of years untouched. I stood at the threshold, my hands trembling as I clutched the key that had hung on the hook by the kitchen door for decades. It was a small key, unremarkable, but it felt heavy now, heavier than it ever had when George was alive. He'd always been the one to unlock this space, his sanctuary of wrenches and wood shavings, where he'd disappear for hours on weekends. I hadn't set foot in here in years, not since the early days of our marriage when I'd bring him coffee and watch him tinker, his strong hands coaxing life from broken things. George had been gone for 3 months now. A heart attack, sudden and merciless, had taken him while he mowed the lawn on a Sunday afternoon. I'd found him there, sprawled in the grass, his face still warm but his eyes vacant. The grief was a weight I carried everywhere, a stone lodged in my chest. But today, I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to clean, to sort through the remnants of his life, to make space for whatever came next if anything could come next. The garage door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a world frozen in time. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, some labeled in George's precise handwriting: tools, old records, winter gear. Others were unmarked, their contents a mystery. A workbench stretched along the far wall, littered with screwdrivers, a rusty vise, and a half-finished birdhouse that would never be completed. I ran my fingers over the wood, feeling the rough grain, and my throat tightened. This was George's domain, his refuge. I felt like an intruder. I started with the easy things, sorting tools into piles, sweeping sawdust into a dustpan. But as the hours passed, the task grew heavier. Each item I touched carried a memory: a hammer he'd used to build our daughter's treehouse, a radio that had played jazz while we danced in the driveway one summer night. I was unraveling him, piece by piece, and it felt like losing him all over again. By noon, I'd cleared half the workbench when I noticed a small, locked cabinet tucked beneath it. It was metal, dented, and coated in grime, the kind of thing you'd overlook unless you were searching. I hadn't seen it before, or maybe I had and never thought twice about it. George had always been private about his work in here, and I'd respected that. But now, curiosity gnawed at me. I retrieved the keyring from the hook above the bench, trying each key until one clicked. Inside the cabinet was a single item: a leather-bound journal, its cover worn but intact. My heart stuttered. George wasn't a writer. He was a man of action, of calloused hands and practical solutions. Yet here was this journal, its pages yellowed, its edges curling. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over it. This wasn't mine to open. But he was gone, and I was alone, and the weight of that truth pushed me forward. I carried the journal to the house, settling at the kitchen table where we'd shared countless meals. The first page was dated 30 years ago, the ink faded but legible. For my thoughts, George had written in his familiar scrawl: "For the things I can't say." My breath caught. What couldn't he say? To me. To our daughter, Ellie. To the world. The entries began innocently enough: notes about his work as a mechanic, frustrations with a stubborn engine, pride in a job well done. But as I read on, the tone shifted. He wrote about a man named Daniel, someone I'd never heard of. "Daniel came by the shop today." One entry read, "He's still angry. I don't blame him, but I can't fix it." Another, "Daniel's letter arrived. I burned it. I can't face it yet." My stomach twisted. Who was Daniel? Why was George hiding this? I turned the pages, each one pulling me deeper into a story I didn't understand. George wrote about guilt, about a mistake he'd made long before we met, something that haunted him. The words were vague, maddeningly so, but they carried a weight that pressed against my chest. I should have told her, he wrote in one entry. But how do you confess something that changes everything? I closed the journal, my hand shaking. The man I'd loved for 40 years, the man I thought I knew, had carried a secret. And now, it was mine to unravel. The kitchen was silent except for the tick of the clock on the wall, a relentless reminder of time moving forward while I sat frozen. The journal opened before me. I'd read only a fraction of it, but each word felt like a splinter under my skin. George, my George, had kept something from mesomething big enough to fill pages with regret. I wanted to stop reading, to shove the journal back into the cabinet and pretend I'd never found it. But I couldn't. The truth, once glimpsed, demands to be seen. I poured a glass of water, my hands unsteady, and returned to the pages. The entries grew more scattered, spanning years. Some were mundane grocery lists, reminders to fix the truck, but others were raw, unguarded. George wrote about dreams that woke him in the night, dreams of a boy he couldn't reach. Daniel's face again. One entry read, "Always the same." I failed him. My mind raced. Was Daniel a friend? A relative? A son? The thought stopped me cold. We had Ellie, our only child, born 5 years after we married. Could there have been someone else? I pushed the thought away, but it lingered like a shadow. George and I had met when I was 25, both of us working at a diner in town. He was the cook, I was the waitress, and our love had grown over late-night coffee and shared laughter. He'd never spoken of anyone before me. No serious relationships. No hidden past. Or had he? I racked my memory, searching for clues I might have missed. A name dropped in passing. A moment of hesitation. Nothing came. By evening, I'd reached an entry from 10 years ago. Daniel found me again. George wrote. He's grown now. A man. He wants answers. I don't know how to give them. My heart pounded. This wasn't some distant memory. Daniel was real. Someone who'd tracked George down. I needed to know more. But the journal offered no clear answers. Only fragments of a story George had buried. I called Ellie. She was 35 now, living in the city with her husband and 2 kids. Her voice was warm but tired when she answered. "Mom, you okay?" she asked, sensing the strain in my tone. I didn't mention the journal. Not yet. Instead, I asked if she'd ever heard her father talk about someone named Daniel. There was a pause, then a soft, "No, doesn't ring a bell." Why? I brushed it off, saying I'd found an old name in some papers. But the lie felt sour. Ellie deserved the truth, but I didn't have it yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. The journal sat on my nightstand, a silent accusation. I kept seeing George's face, not the man who'd kissed me goodnight every evening, but the one in those pages, weighed down by something I couldn't grasp. At dawn, I returned to the garage, driven by a need to find more. The cabinet was empty, but the boxes lining the walls called to me. I tore into them, pulling out old receipts, manuals, a faded baseball cap. Then, in an unmarked box, I found a stack of letters tied with twine. The letters were addressed to George, the handwriting unfamiliar. The postmarks were from various cities, spanning decades. I opened the oldest one, dated 1978, 2 years before we met. "You can't keep ignoring me," it read. "I deserve to know why you left." It was signed, Daniel. My knees buckled. I sank to the garage floor, the letter trembling in my hands. George had left someone who mattered enough to write, to demand answers. And he'd never told me. I read through the night, each letter a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Daniel's tone shifted over the year's anger, then resignation, then a quiet plea for connection. The last letter, dated 5 years ago, was different. "I'm coming to see you." It read, "We need to talk. Face to face." My mind spun. Had they met? What had George said? And why had he kept this from me? The letters were a map to a part of George I'd never known. But they raised more questions than they answered. I spent the next day cross-referencing them with the journal, trying to piece together the timeline. Daniel had been a constant in George's life, a shadow that followed him through the years. The letters hinted at a betrayal, a moment when George had walked away from something or someone important. But the details were maddeningly vague, and the journal offered no clarity, only guilt-soaked confessions. I needed answers, but the garage was a dead end. The boxes yielded nothing more, just relics of a life I thought I understood. I turned to the internet, searching for Daniel with George's last name, then variations of it. Nothing matched. I tried old phone books, even called a few numbers listed under George's name from decades ago. Dead ends. All of them. Frustration burned in my chest, mingling with grief. I wasn't just mourning George anymore. I was mourning the trust I'd placed in him. By the third day, I was exhausted, my eyes sore from reading faded ink. I sat in the garage, surrounded by open boxes, when a memory surfaced. Years ago, George had mentioned a high school friend who'd moved away, someone he'd lost touch with. He'd been vague, his voice tight, and I let it go. Could that have been Daniel? I dug through our old photo albums, hoping for a clue. In a faded picture from George's senior year, I found it, a group of boys by a lake. George among them, his arm around a lanky teenager with dark hair. On the back, in George's handwriting, me and Danny. Summer 75. Danny. Daniel. My pulse quickened. This was him. The boy in the photo looked about 17, his smile wide but guarded. I studied George's face in the picture, searching for the man who'd written those journal entries. He looked happy, unburdened. What had changed? I decided to call Ellie again. This time, I told her everything: the journal, the letters, the photo. Her silence was heavy. Then she said, "Mom, you need to find this guy. If Dad kept this secret, it matters." She was right. But the thought terrified me. What if Daniel's story shattered the memory of the man I'd loved? What if it changed how Ellie saw her father? I tracked down George's old high school, now a community center, and spoke to a librarian who remembered him. She didn't know Daniel, but suggested I check the yearbooks. The next day, I drove to the center and pored over the 1975 yearbook. Daniel's full name was Daniel Harper, a name that meant nothing to me, but everything to George. The librarian gave me a lead, a local historian who kept records of the town's families. I left a message, my voice shaking as I explained my search. That night, I dreamed of George. He was in the garage, his back to me, working on that unfinished birdhouse. I called his name, but he didn't turn. When I reached for him, the scene shifted, and I was holding the journal, its pages blank. I woke with tears on my cheeks, the weight of his absence heavier than ever. The historian called back the next morning. Daniel Harper had lived in town until 1976, then moved away. His family was gone, but there was a record of a Daniel Harper living 2 states over, now in his late 60s. My heart raced. Was this him? I wrote down the address, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I'd say if I found him, but I had to try. The drive to Daniel Harper's address took 3 hours, each mile stretching my nerves thinner. The journal and letters were in a bag on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of why I was here. I'd told Ellie I was going, and she'd offered to come, but this felt like something I had to do alone. The road wound through small towns, past fields and fading barns, and I wondered what George would think of me now, chasing a ghost from his past. The address led to a modest house on a quiet street, its lawn neatly trimmed. A single car in the driveway. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel. What if Daniel didn't want to see me? What if he didn't know George was gone? I took a deep breath and walked to the door, clutching the journal like a shield. A man answered, his hair white, but his frame strong, his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked. I introduced myself, my voice unsteady, and mentioned George's name. His face changed surprise, then something deeper, like pain. "You're George's wife," he said. Not a question. I nodded, and he invited me in. His living room was warm, filled with books and photos. A picture on the mantel caught my eye, 2 boys by a lake. The same image I'd found in George's album. Daniel followed my gaze. "That's us," he said quietly. "Me and George. A lifetime ago." He offered me tea, and we sat at his kitchen table, the journal between us. I told him about George's death, about the garage, the letters, the secrets. Daniel listened, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he sighed, a sound heavy with years. "I didn't think I'd ever talk about this," he said, "but you deserve to know." Daniel and George had been best friends in high school, inseparable until their senior year. They'd planned to enlist together, to see the world. But a fight changed everything. It was over a girl. Daniel said, his voice low. "Stupid. Really. But we were young. George got her pregnant. She was my sister, Clara." My heart stopped. George had a child. Before me. Daniel continued, his words careful but raw. Clara had miscarried, and the loss broke her. George, overwhelmed by guilt, cut ties with both of them. He thought he was protecting us, Daniel said, but it felt like betrayal. I tried to reach him, wrote those letters, but he kept his distance. Years later, I tracked him down, just to talk. He was married by then. To you. He said he couldn't face the past, not without hurting you. I sat in stunned silence. George had carried this alone, a wound he'd never shared. Did he ever meet her again? I asked. Daniel shook his head. Clara died 10 years ago. Cancer. I told George, but he wouldn't come to the funeral. Said it was too late to make things right. We talked for hours, piecing together the fragments of George's guilt. Daniel wasn't angry anymore, just tired. He'd forgiven George long ago, but George never forgave himself. As I left, Daniel handed me a photo of Clara, a young woman with kind eyes. "She'd want you to know she didn't hate him," he said. I clutched the photo, my eyes burning. The drive home was a blur. Clara's photo on the seat beside me. I felt raw, like I'd been cracked open. George's secret wasn't just a story, it was a life. A loss. A choice that had shaped him long before we met. I didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken. Maybe both. He'd loved me. I knew that. But he'd also kept a piece of himself hidden, locked away in that garage. At home, I sat with the journal again, seeing it differently now. The entries about Daniel weren't just guilt, they were grief for Clara, for the life they might have had, for the friend he'd lost. I read until dawn, my eyes tracing his words, searching for the man I'd married. In one entry, written after Ellie was born, he wrote, "I don't deserve this happiness, but I'll fight to keep it." I cried then. For him. For us. For all the things left unsaid. I called Ellie and told her everything. She listened, her voice breaking as I described Clara. "Daniel, the weight George carried. He should have told you," she said, angry and sad all at once. "But he loved you, Mom." "I know he did." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Love wasn't the question, it was trust. Over the next week, I sorted through the garage with new purpose. I kept some things the birdhouse, the radio, but donated others, letting go of the weight. I framed Clara's photo and placed it on the mantel beside one of George and me. It felt right, honoring her place in his story. I wrote to Daniel, thanking him for his honesty, promising to stay in touch. He was part of George, and now, part of me. The journal stayed on my nightstand. I read it slowly, savoring the pieces of George I'd never known. Some entries hurt, but others were beautiful moments of joy, love, hope. He wrote about me, about Ellie, about the life we'd built. She's my second chance. He wrote once, about me. I won't mess this up. My heart ached. He hadn't messed it up. Not entirely. But he'd carried too much alone. I started writing in the journal, too, adding my thoughts to his. It felt like a conversation, a way to bridge the gap between us. I wrote about my anger, my love, my forgiveness. I wrote about Clara, about Daniel, about the life we'd all shared, even if we hadn't known it. Spring came, and with it, a softness I hadn't felt in months. The garage was empty now, the walls bare, the air clean. I'd turned it into a small workshop, a place for my own projects: painting, gardening, things I'd put off for years. It wasn't George's space anymore, but it carried his memory. Lighter now, less burdened. Ellie visited with the kids, and we talked about George. Not just the secret, but the man's father who'd built tree houses, the husband who'd danced in the driveway. The kids ran through the yard, their laughter echoing where George had fallen. It hurt, but it was a good hurt, the kind that meant healing. I met Daniel again, this time for coffee in town. He brought more photos, stories of George as a boy, reckless and loyal. We laughed, we cried, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing George whole, not just the man I'd loved, but the one who'd struggled, failed, and tried to make things right in his own way. Daniel and I became friends, bound by a shared piece of the past. The journal became my companion. I filled its pages with my own story, weaving it with George's. I wrote about forgiveness, about how love doesn't erase mistakes, but holds them gently. I wrote to George, telling him I understood, that I wished he'd trusted me, but that I loved him still. I wrote to Clara, thanking her for the part of George she'd shaped, even if it hurt to know. One evening, as the sun set, I sat in the garage, now my own. The birdhouse was finished, painted blue, hanging in the yard. A sparrow had already claimed it. I held the journal, its weight familiar now, and felt a quiet peace. George's secrets hadn't destroyed us. They'd opened a door to a deeper truth. He was flawed, human, and so was I. And in that shared imperfection, I found a way to keep loving him, to keep living. I closed the journal and looked out at the yard, where the kids' laughter still lingered. Life went on, not without pain, but with hope. I wasn't ready for George's secrets when I found them, but they'd led me here to a place where grief and love could coexist, where the past could rest, and the future could begin.